Okay, welcome back. Okay, we will talk about helping and harming other people. So we have this idea that there is safety in numbers, but as the research on bystander non-intervention or the bystander effect would show, this isn't always true. The bystander effect occurs when we see someone in need, but we don't help them. That is, we notice there is something wrong with the situation, but we don't do anything about it. One of the most haunting examples is this Kitty Genovese murder. A woman named Kitty was walking home at night after work and was attacked by a man over 35 minutes. She screamed and called for help, but people reported noticing, but nobody came to her aid, and few people even bothered to call the police. Why? Well, to understand, let's take a look at the research on the bystander effect. Starting with this classic set of studies by these two researchers, please check the videos in the notes section of the PowerPoint. So let's see what happened. When there is smoke in the lab, when there is just one person in the lab, 70% of the time that person will come to help. So, there are two important concepts related to this bystander non-intervention. The first is called pluralistic ignorance. We get this idea that if nobody else in the group is reacting, then it must be just us. We must be seeing something that nobody else is seeing, and therefore it may not be an issue. Maybe it's just us overthinking, there is no real emergency there. We may think like that. The second factor is called diffusion of responsibility. This is where we do recognize that there is an emergency, but due to the fact that others are around, we assume that someone else is going to take the control. Someone else is going to take care of it. So, what can you do if you are in an emergency situation and you need help? If there are lots of people around, especially, rather than just generally calling out for help, single someone out. Point to someone, say, "You in the red, please help." Do whatever it takes to make a person feel individually responsible. This combats diffusion of responsibility. Related to the bystander non-intervention, we have this concept of social loafing. If you have ever done a group project, you know what I'm talking about. Social loafing is people's tendency to be less productive in groups. So in this case, the whole is less than the sum of the parts. But why does this happen? Well, it's again this diffusion of responsibility where people feel less responsible for doing the most. In studies of cheerleading and the tug of war, what research shows is that when people cheer alone or tug of war alone, they put more effort into it. They cheer louder, they pull harder than when they are in groups. Interestingly, there are some cultural differences. Collectivists are more invested in group outcomes. They have conducted less social loafing than individualists. So, how can we combat these social loafing tendencies, we need to ensure each person is identifiable. We need to encourage personal ownership. For example, if you are conducting a research with 3 other people, you need to make each person identifiable. Person A is responsible for designing the research. Person B is responsible for conducting the research. And person C is responsible to writing up the results. So they each have their parts and their name is associated with their task. So obviously there are some barriers to helping others. But plenty of people do end up behaving prosocially. That is, they take actions to help others. These actions are considered altruism if people doing them is doing so for unselfish reasons. The question is, do true altruism exist? Research does seem to support that people do help others without any selfish reasons. People help others due to empathy. In one experiment, participants who were made to feel empathy towards another person who is undergoing painful shocks were more likely to step in and take the shocks in her place than participants who were not given this empathy manipulation. So you need to feel empathetic towards another person to help them. Whether or not we decide to behave prosocially also depends on situational influences. For example, we are more likely to help when we are unable to escape the situation. If we are stuck where we are and there is not an easy out, it improves our chance of helping because we can't really run away from the situation. The second situational factor is the characteristics of the victim. We are less likely to help a person that we think is in their bad situation due to their own choices. So we are less likely to help a drunk person over an elderly or disabled person because we believe the drunk person become drunk is because of their own choices. But for elderly people and disabled people, they have a tough situation not because of their own choices. Okay, now, so we have an understanding of how others can influence our behavior. Now we are going to transition to talk about how our own attitudes and beliefs can affect our own behaviors. Okay, the way we think about things can be broken down into beliefs and attitude. Belief is the conclusion regarding factual evidence. For example, you can have a belief about whether death penalty effectively deters people from committing murder or not. And what is attitude? Attitude is the belief with an emotional component. For example, if I ask you, how do you feel about death penalty? Your answer will be your attitude is. So this is a belief with an emotional component in it. So one thing to keep in mind, the attitudes we already have influence the attitudes we form about new things a new situation. You can see this clever commercial, for example. Oftentimes, we assume that we act in accordance with our attitude. However, the evidence shows that there is only a modest association between attitude and behavior. So, when is our behavior more likely to accurately reflect our attitudes? For one, when attitudes are highly accessible, they are more likely to predict our behavior. In other words, highly accessible attitudes come to mind easily. For example, if you ask me how I feel about buying some crazy ice cream flavor I have never even heard about, and then you ask me how I feel about buying some Chucky Monkey ice cream, which I'm much more familiar with, my attitude towards the Chunky Monkey ice cream is more accessible to me. So, my attitudes towards the Chunky Monkey ice cream are more likely to determine my ice cream purchasing decision. In addition, deeply held stable attitudes are more predictive of our actual behavior. These are core attitudes that are deeply ingrained and likely follow us throughout our lives. They are also more difficult to change. Therefore, they tend to align pretty well with our behavior. For example, I have deeply held highly positive attitudes towards cats, and so my attitudes towards cats are more likely to correspond with cat-related behaviors than other people. You can use my attitudes to predict whether or not I will stop and try to pet a stray cat, for example. A personality trait called low self-monitoring is also associated with greater attitude-behavior correspondence. Low self-monitors tend to act according to their beliefs, despite situational influences. On the other hand, high self-monitors are much more likely to change their behavior depending on the social circumstances, and therefore, the attitude-behavior link is weaker for high self-monitors. So sometimes we behave in ways that don't really align with our attitudes and beliefs. We all do that. But we also know that our attitudes and beliefs can shift over time. Maybe you used to hate veggies as a kid, and now you love them. Maybe your political beliefs have shifted greatly since you were younger. And yet we tend to perceive ourselves as consistent over time, and often we perceive that we are more consistent in our attitudes than we really are. Although we often think about our attitudes influencing our behavior also influences our attitudes. Festinger studied how behave in a way that is inconsistent with our attitudes can actually change our attitudes. Festinger called this cognitive dissonance theory. Cognitive dissonance is an unpleasant state of tension resulting from holding two conflicting thoughts or beliefs. According to Festinger, this unpleasant state of tension causes us to change our attitude or to come up with an external justification for why these two cognitions are conflicting. For example, let's think about help someone in need. So you meet someone who needs help, and your cognition, your belief about yourself is that I love helping people. I'm really warm-hearted. But actually your behavior is I walked by someone who needed help. I didn't really help them. When that happens, we have this cognitive dissonance. We have two conflicting beliefs or conflicting belief and behavior. When it happens, we have three strategies. First, change the cognition. You can think, okay, I guess I don't love helping people that much actually. You can change the belief about yourself. Or you can change your behavior. You can start volunteering. You can go back and help that person. The third option is you can generate a cognition that reconciles A and B. You can think that, oh, I love helping people, but I had to get to the class, the situation influenced my behavior. So we're humans that we don't like cognitive dissonance, so we try our best to reconcile cognitive dissonance by either changing cognition, changing behavior, or generate some beliefs that reconciles cognition and behavior. So Festinger designed a very smart experiment to test cognitive dissonance theory. They asked participants complete a super boring task, like turning knobs on a board in a very structured fashion over and over again, for half an hour. After the participants finished, the experimenter asked them to help recruit a participant waiting in the hall by telling them how fun and enjoyable the task was. The participants were either paid $1 or $20 in exchange for this lie. In the end of the study, the researchers asked the participants how much they enjoyed the task. Who do you think said they enjoyed the task more? We might expect the participants who were paid $20 should say they enjoyed the task more, but the participant paid $1 said they enjoyed the task more than the participants paid $20. Why is that? All participants should have experienced the cognitive dissonance. The task was incredibly boring, but they told the waiting participant that the task was fun and enjoyable. Yet, the $20 group had a really good external justification for having these conflicting cognitions, for telling this lie. That is a lot of money. I get paid a lot to tell this lie. However, the $1 group had little justification for telling the lie that the task was fun. They are not paid a lot. Therefore, the $1 group changed their cognition about how enjoyable the task was in order to reduce conflict between two cognitions. The only easy way to reduce conflict was to convince themselves that they thought, oh, the task was fun. How can we convince people to change their attitudes and beliefs? Deal process models suggest that we can persuade via two different routes. The central route is informational, factual, content-based. This is where you might make a logic-based argument to try and convince someone to buy a product or change their mind about an issue. We can also persuade others through the peripheral route, which is effective when people are not paying much attention or they don't have much cognitive resources with you. So the peripheral route focuses on the surface aspect of the message or the source. In advertisement, we often see celebrity endorsement. These endorsements can be effective because we have an attractive, successful person associated with the product. So, when we use the peripheral route to persuade other people, it matters how the persuader looks like, how credible they appear. If we ask a normal salesperson to ask you to buy something versus a person with lots of degrees and credentials to ask you to buy something, you are more likely to buy from the person who have lots of credentials because they seem more credible, although these two people may say exactly the same thing to persuade you. Here are some persuasion tricks you can use to persuade other people. The first is foot in the door. You start with a small request and move to a larger one. If you get someone to agree to a small request, like putting a little sticker on their window, they are more likely to comply to a much larger request, like putting a large sign in their yard. The second technique is called the door in the face. You start something big and then back off. For example, you ask someone to donate $100, and then actually you're only asking for $1. So your actual request seems smaller in comparison. Therefore, people are more likely to comply with you. The third technique is called the lowball technique. We start with a low price and then adds on all the desirable options. It's a technique that companies often use to sell you things, to sell you some services. So we gave someone an offer they cannot refuse. Once they have agreed, this is when you add all the caveats. Similar to the foot in the door technique, we start with something small and then go big. But the difference is that foot in the door is about getting people to agree to two separate things. Lowball is about getting people to agree to something and then changing the nature of that thing.